This time in the Magic Kitchen, we are joined by author Nicholas Pearson.
I'm Leandra Witchwood.
And I'm Elyse Welles.
And welcome to the Magic Kitchen podcast, where we talk about magic, kitchen witchcraft, herbs,
and everything in between.
Magic Kitchen Podcast is funded and supported by thewitchwoodteahouse.com, offering a variety of hand-blended loose leaf teas as well as loose herbs for all of your ritual, spell work, wellness, and everyday enjoyment needs. If you would like to support this podcast while sipping a great cup of tea, head over to thewitchwoodteahouse.com and find the magic that's in store for you.
Nicholas Pearson has been immersed in all aspects of the mineral kingdom for nearly 30 years. As one of the leading voices in crystal healing today, he offers a unique blend of science and spirituality alongside a grounded, practical approach to working with crystals. The author of several books, including Crystal Basics, he lives in Orlando, Florida. So welcome. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
Great. Yeah, we've been looking forward to having you. Yeah.
Yeah. And we want to start by congratulating you on your many awards won recently. If you could apprise us of all of those, that would be great.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I spent the weekend in Denver at the International New Age Trade Show, which is a big event put on by a not-for-profit called the COVER, or Coalition of Visionary Resources. And it's like the big body, mind, spirit trade organization for professionals in publishing and writing and retailers and body workers and energy healers and anything that kind of falls under this umbrella. And one of the things they've been doing for many years are these visionary awards. So this year, 2 of my books were up for awards in several categories, and I was amazed to not only place in 4 categories, but to even take home a gold in one of them. So Crystal Basics, the big one that came out in 2020, got the silver in the crystal and gemstones category. And then Flower Essences from the Witch's Garden took home a gold, a silver, and a bronze in different categories. So that was really exciting. I think probably the biggest accomplishment was getting bronze in the witchcraft book category, because that's like fierce competition. And I love all those humans who had their books up for awards. So, I took one look at the category. I was like, yeah, I know how this is going to go. And I was wrong, delightfully wrong. But it was a really great experience.
Oh, awesome. That's so cool.
Yeah.
I can't imagine like that feeling, because I agree. Like there is so much competition in the best way. Like we're just a vibrant community of diverse authors with, a quilted background of expertise and paths and practices. Mm-hmm. And I don't even know, like, I would actually hate to be a judge for that category, because it's like, how do you compare some of these books with each other? Like, but yours was a standout. So that well deserved. I'm really excited that we are interviewing you when we are, so we could celebrate that on the show.
Thank you so much for that.
So your latest book it's out now, right? The Crystal Basics Pocket. It's a Pocket Companion. Is that how that's?
Crystal Basics Pocket Encyclopedia.
Encyclopedia. I love that it's a perfect square. That's very aesthetically pleasing.
Yes. I know. So I know what some people are getting as gifts for, birthdays and stuff like that coming up.
Yeah. So how did you whittle down from Crystal Basics to the Pocket Encyclopedia?
So it was kind of an interesting situation, because the book that came out in 2020 with a similar title is not at all the same book. They belong to the same family. They've got very similar spirits, but they're designed for different things. And the big one has, it's by comparison, I don't know that our listeners will get this, but it's a quite a difference in terms of number of pages and the overall trim size.
Oh, yeah.
About half of that book is how to. 50% of it is how crystals work, how they form, what we can do with them in terms of meditation and making elixirs and layouts and grids and more advanced practices. And it's very like textbooky in that regard, but it's only got 200 stones in it. So the pocket encyclopedia, I had to decrease the amount of how to and expand the number of stones by 2.5. It's 250% that number of crystals. So
Wow.
it was just a very judicious application of how can I say this in simplest terms? What is the least amount of background I can give people? And where can I plant a seed for someone to pick up the big book as a companion? So I really view them as complementary tools. Each one stands on its own. You can appreciate one without needing the other, and vice versa. But I guarantee you that if you look up a crystal in one and then look it up in the other, you will find unique data in both. So that way, it doesn't feel like you've duplicated the same book in 2 trim sizes on your shelf.
That's nice. That's excellent, because I find a lot of books, if you try to cross-reference, you just get the same data over and over again. And I think that makes it difficult when we're trying to deepen our knowledge of herbs or crystals or deity, that sort of thing. And if we're just getting regurgitated same information over and over again, we're not really deepening that practice. And I appreciate that. That's awesome. I'm eager now to utilize both resources.
Yeah.
It was. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, it was really kind of fun doing that, because the big one, it's a lot about the why. So, it's a big part of like unpacking the geology behind things and understanding that chemical formula is a key to the energy signature of the crystal, its formation process, its crystal system, its hardness, all that gives us clues. And there just wasn't space to do that as much in a pocket encyclopedia. So especially if you use that pocket encyclopedia, you see the formula and all the other geological data up at the top. Briefly stated, it's just there as a bullet point. But then you can go to Crystal Basics and open up to chapter 2, Decoding Crystals, and see what all of those arcane terms and chemical formula mean. So that's probably my favorite part of using them together. Each one really enriches the other, because with 250 more gems in it, there's a lot of cross-referencing you can do to unpack that code in its geological history.
Awesome.
Well, and I actually wanted to ask more about that. The way that you say in your bio that you combine science and spirituality in that way, because that to me is what makes your writing unique and necessary, because I really wasn't that drawn to crystals, because I'm a very academically minded witch. And some of the older books, you open them and they're like, amethyst means third eye cleansing. Next. And you're like, but why? But who said that? Where does that come from?
Right.
So yeah, a little bit more about that, I think, is needed out there.
For sure. I've always liked science. My dad had a science background. His parents both worked in medicine in various roles. And I've always liked to understand the why behind things. Every little kid asks why a million times, never getting satisfying answers, because there often aren't. But, I kind of kept that habit up and would pursue things through as far as I could. And, pretty early on, I found that my fascination for all things kind of mystical, magical, spiritual was maybe not the typical. I think the average 8-year-old doesn't like immerse themselves in world religion and folklore and folk magic. But that was where my heart was at. But then, like the next trip to the library, it was earth and environmental science and marine biology, or whatever else I could get my hands on that was age appropriate, until I, tore through all that material and had to read things that were not age appropriate, just so that way I could continue learning. But it seemed really evident that spirituality and science were fundamentally performing a similar function in the role of human existence. And that's helping us understand the world and helping us relate to it better. One of those branches does that route rather quantitatively, like what can we measure, what can we compare in rich and data-driven kind of ways, and the other one does it qualitatively. But qualitative data is no less important than quantitative, and anyone who works in the research field has to like wrap their heads around that. And there are some sciences where the only data we get is qualitative. So I kind of looked at them both as metaphors for just kind of getting a grasp on how we fit into the cosmos. And it seemed like there shouldn't be a debate. Like it was just as simple as that. And I think I take for granted how wonderful a realization that was so young. Most people, I don't think, arrive at that. We get so kind of ingrained in one stream or the other that we don't believe they can cross over. But it really came to a head. I started collecting rocks around the age of 8. So we're just shy of 3 decades now. But it came to a head in my teenage years when I realized that all this folklore I learned about rocks and minerals actually still had a practical application in the field of modern crystal healing. You read about what the ancient Egyptians and Romans and Greeks and, medieval doctors did with gems for healing, and you don't necessarily know that people still do things like that. And so by the time I was a teenager, I kind of fell down the rabbit hole with crystal healing. And it was like the perfect intersection. I could study the geology of things and I could learn the kind of mystical. And I started to see little trends that would emerge. When I went to college to study music at university, I actually was randomly assigned, if we believe in random accidents, to work in an earth science museum on campus that at one point was the largest privately owned collection of minerals in the US and is now one of the largest collections in the Southeast. And I just was so enamored. I came in already with so much appreciation and background knowledge that they gave me almost unrestricted access to the collection to be the preparator, which meant I was in charge of what was on display. I got to work with the collection itself. We all had to share duties for like upkeep and maintenance and being docent, like giving people guides. But I really loved the kind of back end of it, working with the rocks and minerals themselves. And it was just great. So great, in fact, that I decided to leave behind my great love of music and to switch my focus to earth and environmental science instead. The universe takes us on strange journeys. So I ran out of money and almost immigrated to Japan and did other things instead of finishing my degree. But I've come back to my love of rocks and minerals over and over and over again. And when I left my corporate America gig, like a decade later, I really kind of put myself into writing so I could merge those parallel ideas of the science and spirituality behind rocks and minerals. And that's kind of what I've been doing ever since.
Wow. That's a great journey.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you.
I really love that. So let me ask, so we're talking about the science of crystals and the effectiveness, the crystal healing, these practices that are pretty ancient. What makes crystals so effective when it comes to healing?
Yeah, great question. So there are layers to this. In the ancient world, I think the first layer that we see is the symbolic and metaphorical, as well as the correspondence. So, we view gems as these kind of perfected things that come from nature, come from the heavens, come from, whatever our kind of mythological strata informs us. We develop these systems of correspondence that go back to some of the earliest writing that we've got. Some of the earliest like documents that persist into the modern day are like cuneiform tablets, one of the oldest of which is a lapidary. It's an inventory of gemstones and their magical and medicinal properties. So this is nothing new. People who think that crystal healing is a new age fad, I mean, I've got news for you. But the thing evolves over time, and we move from this place where things are more metaphorical and symbolic on the outer level, bloodstone for healing the blood, garnet for victory on the battlefield because it's, the color of bloodshed, and, similar things, to a more sophisticated system where we're looking at the environments where things come from or what's inside them. Ultimately, I like to use physics as a metaphor for understanding crystal energy. When we talk healing energies, we're often talking about things we cannot measure and quantify. We're talking about subtle energies, which we have to assume, for lack of a better model, we have to assume that they follow the same laws as the measurable energies, the gross energies that are out there. So I often look to how electromagnetism interacts with crystals to give us a clue for how and what they might be doing on an energetic level. And, the thing about a crystal is that it has to, by definition, have a clear and coherent structure and composition. And it is that kind of regularity or coherency that it has at the molecular level that is a clue to what's happening on an energetic level. All bits of matter produce, background amounts of electromagnetic radiation and, all kinds of stuff. All of matter has to have some level of organization, but the more organized that structure is, then also the more organized its electrical field is going to be, its electromagnetic field rather, is going to be. And so, functionally, what we see when things come together, when their kind of subtle energy fields communicate, when they overlap, we see a process of entrainment take place, wherein the more coherent and higher amplitude, in other words, the louder energy field, kind of teaches the less loud one to kind of come into harmony with it. So, when I pick up a piece of quartz, a beautiful specimen of calcite, a good old hunk of granite, the innate structure and regularity, the kind of reassuring rhythm of its energy field is teaching my energy field to be similarly rhythmic, energetic, and crystalline in a way. And we know from modern science, the exploration of things like energy medicine and other kind of related themes, that when we have a coherent electromagnetic field, we also tend to have health. Now, science is very keen on how they word that. I chose the sequence of those words very cautiously so as to imply they correlate but aren't always causal. But it is likely a causal relationship. And the biggest, we'll say, hallmark of that kind of health that we've got on the electromagnetic level is, in particular, heart-brain coherence, when our EEG and EKG are kind of synced up with the same rhythm and same patterns, or at least anharmonic rhythms and patterns, then we see the greatest number of signs for health and wellness. And the thing is that if we can shift things on an electromagnetic level, it means we are also shifting mood and perception, because those have a really strong correlation. When we change our mood, when we change our mental affect, it triggers a sequence of electrical and chemical transmitters that cascade through the body, which ultimately affect all of the metabolic and catabolic processes in the whole organism. So it is possible for energy to transcend pathology. And that's the kind of vehicle I use to, at least metaphorically, understand what's happening. I think there's stuff that's too mystical to be measured and mapped out. I've seen some pretty miraculous, instantaneous things happen, which, laws of science deem not so possible, but that's kind of the point of magic, right? It's to have that suspension of disbelief to enjoy the miraculous. So I try to make sure that I wear both of those hats at the same time so I can appreciate the nuance of all of those experiences at once.
Excellent. I always called it, I'm the skeptical believer.
Totally.
I've got to go through my theology and the reality of it before I deem, yes, that was mystical. Yes, that was a miracle. Or I think that's like a hallmark of being a critical thinker. And I think that's what this path demands. We have to be those critical thinking beings who will look at the whole. And that's, yeah. And I think that demonstrates it. You demonstrated that well with your description there. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And especially like I always look at history and I look for precedent, like, is this just something that somebody wrote in a book in the 90s, or is this something that we can take back? Like if it's in linear B, or it's on a cuneiform tablet, or we have archaeological evidence, and all those things compound. Like, I think that's what makes our path which is so powerful, is we're almost looking to debunk things. Like, we actually want to be proven wrong. Like, if I get in a conversation with somebody about something I think I have an opinion on, and they're able to actually show me a new way to think about it, I'm grateful. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah. I think critical thinking skills are fewer and farther between than they once were, but we have better resources than we've ever had, so long as we utilize them. So it is possible to kind of navigate this well enough. No matter where we are, no matter what our path is, we just have to learn how to ask the right questions, and most importantly, how to find effective answers. And I say effective rather than right or wrong, because some things can't objectively be right or wrong, especially when we go into the spiritual and when we touch into like personal gnosis. In the world of crystals, I've got several hundred books on crystal healing and the history of working with gems and their folklore and things. So it is very frequent. You pick a common stone, calcite, amethyst, fluorite, carnelian, and you read what different authors have to say, and you see that they don't always agree. And that's, honestly a good thing. One of my favorite things to do is to try to find the common thread underneath those things. But I think a lot of the realm of spirituality, at least, popular publishing for the last several decades, has been surface level results. Like what did we get out of this? Not what is the relationship that drove it under the surface. So I like to occupy my time with what got all these people to all these different places. What is the same about them? And how can we see a similar set of mechanisms applied to different circumstances that gave us seemingly different outcomes? But I do recognize that in an increasingly memeified world, our content consumption is too fast and too short to take us there. So I'm happy to use those kind of critical thinking skills and hopefully put out some solid stuff that people can use to understand the depth underneath a seemingly simple practice like carrying a crystal around.
Yeah, I think that's something that we try to encourage on this podcast is, if you find something, a meme on social media, a quick video that intrigues you about a subject, like go study it, go find out more. Don't just take that at surface level, because you're only getting a snippet. You're only getting a teeny tiny bit. And that's meant to encourage you. It's meant to inspire you. So don't think that you just got the download. You didn't. Go find the teacher, go find the book, go find the resource that'll help you learn more. Absolutely.
You may have noticed that here at the Magic Kitchen Podcast, we don't have sponsored ads. That's because this is a fully listener-supported show. We do what we do for you, dear listener, and when you join my magical living community on Patreon, you're supporting all the time and energy that goes into setting up podcast interviews, writing articles and rituals, my paranormal mystery novel, and all that I do. And in exchange, you're getting over 10 exclusive journal prompts, rituals, witch tip videos, meditations, and more each month. If you love this podcast, consider joining my magical space. I can't wait to meet you and be an even bigger part of your magical journey. Go to patreon.com/Elyse Welles or follow the link in the show notes. So you spoke about this process, I think you called it entrainment, where if two energies meet, the stronger energy is going to sort of affect, if not balance, and connect with that other energy. Is that a good definition in short summary?
Think of entrainment as two systems coming into sync with one another. They're harmonizing.
Okay. So with that concept, if I'm thinking about where I'm going with this, is I'm thinking about how a lot of people will say, you're like, oh, magic doesn't work because I tried it and it doesn't work. And we can all say like, well, yeah, it's because you didn't really want it to. Like in that way, they're entraining the magic, maybe if that's the right way to use that word, to not work because they're so ardently sure it's not going to. So could it work? Is that right? Is that sensible?
Yeah, one of the ingredients we haven't talked about so far in crystal healing is human consciousness. We haven't really given it a sense of agency. We've only talked about it as the side effect, but truth be told, we can look to a cliche of pop science today, and that the observer affects the observed. It's one of those kind of quantum phenomena that we see.
Exactly what I was thinking about. The quantum phenomena. Exactly.
We are inherently entangled with the phenomena we seek to observe. No matter how passively we do it, it's going to happen. A great example of this that we see in physics is like the photon debate. Are they particles? Do they have mass? Are they waves? And are they pure energy? Mm-hmm. And what we look for determines what we find. So we can prove that photons are discrete units, they are particles, and they have mass. We can also prove, if the experiment is designed appropriately, that they do not have mass and they are energy. And then, I don't know, maybe a decade or so ago, I can't remember, I think it was at one of the Ivy League schools, someone caught on, massively powerful kind of microscopy, the in-between state where a photon was both a particle and a wave, and it was at the cusp of that transition because someone finally thought to look for that. So, if we think about light as, these little packets of light energy, and if we say packet, we could mean either of those divisions, as being kind of fundamental to everything we experience. Anything we look at, we see because of photons, we see because of that interaction with electromagnetism, and other parts of that electromagnetic skill have to behave in the same way as light. And it's a really, really big scale. It encompasses everything. Imagine if everything around us can be influenced the same way. Our perception, our bias, the filters we look through, change what we're going to experience in the most fundamental ways. And most of this happens so far below that threshold of, conscious awareness that we gotta remember to check our bias. We gotta try to get to that state of neutrality. I like to think of spell work as designing experiments, isolating variables, and collecting data. And if something doesn't work, what can I change about this? And if we change everything all at once, then we haven't done a good job of isolating, the experimental variable. But, ultimately, if something fails, we got to go back to the drawing board. Was it the astrological timing? Was it the color of my candle? Was it my mental affect? Was it the herbs I used? Was it where I did it? There's so many things, and we really have to, keep detailed records on the one hand if we want to be good scientists. But I also think there's a poetry to magic, and poetry and science are not the same thing. So we got to feel it. Poetry works because it makes us feel. Art works because it makes us open our hearts and have an experience outside of our ordinary consciousness. So we've got to treat it as both of these things simultaneously. So maybe the crystal didn't help you manifest the intention you wanted. Maybe that candle spell fizzled out. Why? And, you hit the nail on the head with where we're kind of allowing those expectations to cloud the results because we don't have the buy-in. And that sounds a lot like we're talking placebo effect, but we need the buy-in for anything. I used to work in sales. If I would lead, multi-million-dollar teams to success, and it started with their buy-in in the product. Do you love what we're doing? Then this just isn't right for you. Like if you can't believe in the end result, you're not going to find people who are as excited as you are. And it's not, a brainwashy kind of thing. It's like, let's find the right fit for you. This isn't it. So, it's the same with our spellcraft, our religious practice. Do you have the buy-in? Are you engaged with this in a meaningful way? Might be a better way to say that.
Yeah. Well, in my case, I work with herbs. So developing those relationships is key. And I'm sure it's the same with crystals. So if I'm using a certain herb and the spell fizzled, and I didn't have a good relationship with that herb, with the essence of that herb, the energy of that herb, the consciousness, which I guess this goes back to science, because they're now admitting and approving that what our ancestors have known for centuries, that plants have a consciousness. They feel pain. They remember. They can warn other plants with aerosolized particles. They can act in functions that we never thought possible scientifically or in the logical world possible. And so I think, yeah, that's a good point, is if we're not aligned with that ritual, with that spell, with the ingredients, with the mindset, there's something's going to go wrong. So we have to pick it apart to find out what went wrong. Yeah.
And I think that's where things can go wrong for people. Like one of the big questions we get a lot is, how do I know it's a deity I'm talking to? How do I know it's the land spirit I'm interacting with? How do I know that this is actually my ancestors that are receiving these offerings and not, people use all kinds of words. They use demon, they use, ghost. But everyone has that fear that they're not talking to who they think they're talking to, or that the spell isn't feeling what they felt was so fake because X, Y, and Z. And I think that's a big empowering piece, is just to know that the way we enter it is so much more powerful than anything else we're bringing with us.
Big time, yeah. And it also kind of dovetails into this conversation that Jason Miller brings up a lot of perception versus projection.
Yes.
Like our bias.
We're big fans of his.
Yeah, our bias matters a lot in that. Yeah. Are you projecting that there's nothing there and therefore you can't feel anything? Or are you perceiving that there's nothing there and that's why you can't feel anything? And I mean, we live in an inspirited world. Yeah, I like to wear my science hat, but on the inside, don't tell anyone, I'm like a feral animist. There's a spirit of everything. And when all else fails, just start meeting things at that spirit level. Like,
yes.
Damn the scientific method, just go have a conversation with spirits. You don't have to look very hard to find them once you know the kind of station you got to set your consciousness to. So if you've never found that sense of being surrounded in a good way, actually kind of in an inert way, most non-human spirits don't pay a whole lot of attention to us. But if you've never had that sense of the swarming spirits all around you, then you've just never found the right station on the radio. And that's really like what we got to consider with all of this. In crystal healing, we talk a lot about frequency. People are big on, in the metaphysical kind of new agey idea, this concept of frequency. Frequency is nothing more than the station on the radio. If we go back to the ancient and mystical era, when our car stereos actually had knobs on them that did there are two knobs we have to pay attention to if we want to hear our music: the dial for volume, and that's amplitude. That's the one we neglect in a lot of metaphysical spaces. And then the one with those funny numbers attached to it. And those numbers are megahertz. It's the number of thousands of cycles per second. So it's the literal frequency at which the station is broadcasting. So we have to be able to fine tune both of those, because it turns out most stations where we find there is kind of spirit activity, the volume is very, very low.
Oh.
And we are not. So we got to be able to crank up their volume so that way we can be entrained by it rather than the other way around. We unwittingly lead a lot of those conversations to nowhere on an energetic level because of where we've set our own dial and how loud we've set our own volume. And I'm not asking people to dial back their own volume, but to be able to find the stillness, the spaciousness, to let the spirits around them speak. And that's where that idea of perception and projection really kind of sidles up into this conversation about our own buy-in as well and our own bias. Yeah. So it's a nuanced and ongoing process, I think, for all of us. We're not all there all the time.
No.
I love that analogy of the frequencies, because I like kind of personally don't love when people are like low vibration, high vibration. I'm like, what are you talking about? Because I agree. I'm just, it's like, where am I? And sometimes I turn the volume down, like if like, not dampening any moods here, but I visited a concentration camp last month and I turned the volume of that way down because otherwise I couldn't have been there. And I was there to respect the spirits of the dead, but not to be, there's a lot of energy there that you don't want to take with you. And, I shielded and cleansed and did everything right, but it's an affecting energy. Whereas my main work is with land spirits and spirits of place and helping people see the value in that, understanding that connecting to your environment and your local land spirits is super helpful and important. And they're your greatest allies of protection. But then also when you're traveling, connecting to those land spirits can enrich your life more so than just being in the place without, saying hello. And that's a hard one for people because I think it's a radio station that really gets neglected. It's just something that they skip right past it to the greatest hits. And I don't know what they're playing on land spirits. Maybe it's like bluegrass, but it's just not getting listened to. But when you stop and listen, they're having a good time. They're fun.
Yeah. And just to add to that, I think what happens sometimes, and the person probably doesn't even realize it, because this is my personal anecdote. When I was young, the volume was very high on spirit. They were always loud. They were always around. So over time, as a young child, I learned to turn that dial completely off. I learned to tune it out completely. So as I got older and I realized how valuable it was hard for me to retune that frequency and find the right volume and tune it in to where I could at will reconnect with that radio station or the stations. Because when I was a child, I was overwhelmed by it. Like they were in my closet, they were next to my bed, they were everywhere. It was way too loud. And some have that, they might not even remember that they had that instance because we get programmed, we get reprogrammed, we get deprogrammed, and we stop learning how to tune in. So we get older and we're like, I need to connect with this deity, but I can't. Like, why can't I connect? Why is it so silent? And we forget that it's goes to us. We have to manage our energy, and witchcraft is mastering that energy, getting yourself into that position where you can focus and turn those dials. Using that metaphor, I like it. Join me, Leandra Witchwood, in the Rebel Mystic community as we come together and explore the radical, rebellious act of creating sisterhood and engaging in deep self-care.
So let's talk a little bit about flower essences in the witch's garden. I feel like we've talked so much about crystals, but flower essences, if it's herbalism, that's quite tangential in the way that we connect to those spirits.
Yeah, I love working with flower essences because it differs from a lot of the other available kinds of, we'll say, plant practices that are out there. It is predominantly oriented towards a therapeutic mechanism, a therapeutic model, but it is non-chemical in nature, non-physical in nature. And that, of course, leads us to a whole bunch of interesting gymnastics we sometimes have to do if we're a little more scientifically oriented, a little more left-brained, in that functionally, we pick up a bottle of a flower essence like this bunchberry essence I've got right here. And it's basically like on a material level, that bottle is filled with water and a preservative, in this case, brandy, and basically nothing else. But repeated studies show us, well-designed experiments at least, that understand the principles of flower essence therapy, show us that they perform better than placebos, that the results are repeatable, that they can be double-blind and still be effective. But we also have to embrace the therapeutic models required for understanding them, which is very personalized. So, what can be in this bottle of inert liquid that is causing responses that are, not inert? And it boils down to the same thing over and over again. The very clinically minded flower essence therapists will tell you this. So the very magically minded plant spirit kind of magicians, that it's the consciousness of the plant is somehow distilled or imprinted upon the liquid in that bottle. And that through a process of serial dilution, kind of inspired by homeopathy, but not with the same rigor, we get this really kind of clarified, distilled soul quality that comes from that plant, that is imbued in that water. And when we ingest it, when we spray it in the room around us, when we place it on a pulse point, even though there's no phytochemicals, there's no aroma except for whatever, the brandy or glycerin or apple cider vinegar or whatever the preservative is going to have, in spite of the seeming lack of stuff, there's still a change, or sometimes very soft and subtle change that builds over time. But it takes place because the gift of that plant spirit, the gift of the consciousness of that botanical ally is a kind of like tuning fork for the psyche, for the emotional body. And if we think about what, tuning forks are designed to do, they don't tune your instrument. I don't hit a tuning fork, hear the pitch, and my piano is magically in tune. But it demonstrates what the correct pitch sounds like. So I personally can make the necessary adjustments to get things back in tune. I play the French horn. That's what I went to school for originally. And I've only recently come back to it as like a full-time practice. But, we use those kind of tuners to help us make the little teeny adjustments so we can come back into a state of balance. And it's a dynamic thing. You don't do it once and forget about it. The temperature of the room changes your pitch. The ensemble you're sitting with has a different standard of pitch. The dynamic volume, the sound that you're playing, how big it is, also changes what happens to your pitch. So you got to make adjustments constantly. And it's the same thing with our emotional state, right? We don't just suddenly say, okay, here's the button. This is the happy button. I'm happy forever. No, we're in a constant state of flux. So what flower essences do is they provide us this gentle reminder of what an imbalanced state might be. What is the frequency inharmonic with letting go of things rather than holding on to them? What is the kind of mental groove that we can choose to run along that leads us to a lack of worry rather than being steeped in worry, or not being fearful, or whatever it might be? So much of flower essence therapy is focused on the surface level of like, what is the thing we don't want? And they help us kind of balance that spectrum to get to the complementary force, which is the peaceful or aligned state, maybe we could say. And it's very subtle but really profound. And I've had some really immense effects from working with plant spirits in the form of flower essence therapy over the last 18, 19 years of my life.
So how did you get into flower essences? Because I've never heard that term, if I'm being completely honest. I think it's really, I think you're right. Like, it's a different way of connecting, and I'm really excited. Actually, I think I'm going to literally get your book and read it right now, like after we're done, because that's something I've been working with a lot without having a word for it. Is just the different parts of the plant and how the flowers are just so different. In fact, literally right now, my altar, I've been doing this daily walking meditation where I'll just be called to a flower. I'll pick it, I'll get to know it personally, then I'll look up a little bit about it, and then I float it in water as an offering on my altar. So I'm like very interested to hear about, introduce this like we don't know what it is, because I've never heard of this term. It's so exciting.
Yeah, so flower essences are usually defined as dilute solutions that contain we'll say, energy signature of a plant's consciousness. Modern flower essence therapy was developed in the 1930s by Dr. Edward Batch, who was a physician, a homeopath. He was a brilliant bacteriologist and diagnostician. He went from fields of allopathy into homeopathy and was actually dissatisfied with both of those. He enjoyed the principles of homeopathy because it treats the whole organism. But as far back as his bacteriology studies, he started to notice that he could often figure out the therapeutic protocol by observing people's personalities. One of his big contributions to medicine at the time were the development of certain kinds of immunizations for gut bacteria, for like gut flora. And he developed these 7 inoculations. And, based on what he would observe in a clinical setting, he could often anticipate which one of those was going to actually be required. He'd go through the process of all the right diagnostic tools and test for everything, and that, find the intestinal flora that needed to be, fixed or whatever in his field of specialty. And he would notice that in those seven medicines he created, 7 inoculations, that there were strong indications in people's personality. And he loved that in homeopathy, you would look at things like mental affect and personality as part of the diagnostic picture. But one of his greatest dissatisfactions with both of those fields was that medicines were something that required an immense amount of study, great caution, and were often produced from pretty noxious substances. Things that were on their own inherently toxic or harbingers of disease or required extreme caution. And he was really seeking a system of healing that affected us on a soul level and was safe and easy enough to learn that anyone could do it. So he took his training in both of those fields and kind of distilled them in his quest for medicine for the people. And that's how the flower essences were born. He started with 7, and that eventually grew. It grew at first into like a set of 19. And then right at the end of his life, he developed a second set of 19 to create these 38 remedies. And now the principles he set forth are practiced by people all over the world. But he started with this method of floating freshly harvested blossoms on water and letting the energy of the sun, almost think of it as like taking a photograph of these soul qualities of the plant. The bowl is your camera, the water is the film, and you need light in both of these things. You need to expose the film to light to get it to work. But in this case, of course, the light is not between the subject and the film, it's on the other side of the subject and the film. But water has this incredible memory to it. We've got plenty of studies, both rigorous and not so rigorous ones out there. People like to cite the kind of pop science of Dr. Emoto and other people that demonstrates the memory of water. But going back quite a long time, we have data that shows that the molecules of water, which are polar molecules, they have kind of a positive and negative pole on them. Although they're electromagnetically neutral at the end of the day, there are regions, kind of like the North and South Pole of our planet. There are regions that kind of emphasize these 2 polar energies. And they will organize themselves or line themselves up, positive to negative, north to south, just like the poles of a magnet will naturally be attracted to one another. And the shapes that water molecules can make by organizing in this way reflect the same organizational principles we find in all 7 crystal systems in the mineral kingdom, and that they're malleable. It's what we call a liquid crystal mesophase, or at least ideally it's supposed to be a liquid crystal mesophase, which means it's a state in between liquidity and crystallinity. And it responds to very, very, very weak sources of electromagnetism to alter its organizational level. So even if we want to take the woo out of this, if we don't want to have a conversation about things we can't quantify, like plant spirits, then it is very likely that radiant energy we get from the sun, light is electromagnetism, is enough to power this response wherein water molecules are entrained by or organized by the signatures of those plants. We use the flowers because it's thought to be the highest expression, the most unique expression of plant consciousness. And then, once that's done, we obviously have to preserve it because we don't want things to grow and, get our bottles fuzzy. But, using those dropperfuls that are filled with what appears to be inert water and preservative, we've actually got structured water in there that is effecting change on one level or another when we take them in.
It's funny
That's
because
amazing.
I'm watching Elise's face as you're talking about dropping the petals in the water. And because I knew it when she said that earlier, I was like, oh, you're halfway there, honey.
Yeah, you really are.
It is the weirdest thing. I literally I got back from like a 3-week trip, and I went through 9 different countries in Europe, and I just connected with the land in just different ways because I'd never driven through Europe before. And it was so, when you're on airplanes and stuff, it's not the same. And when I got back to Greece, I really wanted to just connect back to this land and ground myself. And I found myself like with some flowers, but I didn't want to pick a bouquet. I just wanted to get like one. And then I came home. I was like, what do I do with it? And I just put it in. Like I felt so guided through this process. Like it was just like, well, next you're going to do this. Like, could you just put in some water, and why don't you make it an offering? So it's literally in the sun on my altar, like right now.
That's exactly
it's
what
like
it needs
freaking
to be.
me out. That is wild. But I think it's a poisonous flower. It's oleander. So yeah, I'm not going to do it.
Well, in my experience working with plant essences, it's a great way to work with the poisonous plants without having a negative effect, because it's just the essence of it. You're not getting the chemical in it that's going to harm you. So you are exactly where you need to be, and you are being 100% guided. I absolutely love it.
Oh, that's crazy. That's crazy, man.
Yeah.
I'm not kidding. I'm literally like gonna grab my Kindle and get your book right away. I'm not ordering it. Like I'm gonna start it.
That's awesome. So great.
So on that note, I suppose, tell everybody where they can get your books and connect with you and keep up to date with you. And we'll put these links in the show notes, of course, as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. If you want to track me down, I'm at the Luminous Pearl in most places. I spend the most time on Instagram, but you can also find me on TikTok and Facebook. My website is theluminouspearl.com. There's kind of a theme here. But as far as finding my books, check your local independent bookstore, your local metaphysical or occult bookseller. If they don't have it, I'm sure they would be delighted to order it for you. You can order directly from my publisher at innertraditions.com. You can find them online from Amazon and Barnes & Noble and just about any other bookseller. My mantra is every book sold is a good book sold. So, wherever is the most effective place for a listener to get it, go do it that way. I love being able to teach. I love being able to share, and writing has become an extension of that. So that's why there are so many books in so little time.
That's fantastic. Oh, yeah. It was really great to have you, and yes, I hope to have you on again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been fun.
Well, thank you both, and I'd be delighted to join you anytime.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much. Merry meet,
merry part, and merry meet again.
Thank you for joining us on the Magic Kitchen podcast. Please visit my website, leandrawitchwood.com, for news, information, and more episodes.
I'm Elyse Welles, and I can be found at Seeking Numina on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, and seekingnumina.com. That's Seeking, Numina.